Hello, everybody. Today I am joined by John Osborne, the well-known art historian or historian of art, who is an expert on the early Middle Ages and most recently known for his three-volume series on the history of Rome in the 8th century, the 9th century, and the 10th century, published by the British School at Rome uh, and Cambridge University Press. John received his PhD from the Courtauld Institute in 1979 and was thereafter professor at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Then at the University, Queen's University in Kingston, before moving up to becoming Dean of Arts and Sciences at Carleton University, where his father had been professor in 2005. And I asked him to join me today to talk not just about his professional life, but also some of his personal life insofar as it interacts with his studies. And I had quite a long list of questions for John, but hopefully we'll be able to get through most of them, and we'll learn a fair amount about John and his career and all sorts of different things. So, welcome, John.
Thank you, Richard. Glad to be here. I'll correct you on one small thing. It was Dean
Yes.
of Arts and Social Sciences
Okay.
at Carleton.
Okay. Yes, at Queen's, you would have been Dean of Arts and Sciences,
Yeah,
but um, and my first question for you is right sort of at the beginning of John Osborne as a historian of art or historian in art. Uh, it's about your early life and really about when you had your first inkling of your calling as a historian of material culture, let's say.
sure. I think my calling was as an historian first.
Mhm.
So I moved a lot when I was small, including a couple of years in Scotland, where my father did his doctorate at Edinburgh, and I got very interested in visiting castles, which we did most weekends. And then I came back. When we came back to Canada, I got very interested in Canadian history. And the material aspect of it only really developed when I took a course in Venice in the summer of 1970 when I was 18, and got then involved in the monuments. Um, because I'd read a lot of early medieval history in high school and so on, and Robert Graves, Count Belisarius, and all kinds of other things, and was really interested in that period. But in Canada, we don't have buildings for that period. But in Venice, they did, and those were just fascinating. So when I came back after that summer, I started taking some art history courses, and I think I was an English history major, double major at the time, and slowly but surely, those were the most interesting courses, and so I ended up getting an honors degree in art history instead of English and history. But there were a lot of English and history courses in my degree as well, and yeah, so that's how it got started.
And what prompted you to take this course?
I saw a poster advertising it on a notice board, and I thought, wow, that would be really interesting. I was in love with European history and European culture generally, and languages and so on. And I happened to mention it to my grandmother at Christmas, and she said, "You want to go? I'll pay for it." And I thought, "Wow, okay, not to be missed." And so it happened. Yeah,
That's wonderful.
serendipity.
So that leads me to my second question, as whether you can tell me about your parents and how they maybe encouraged or modeled um, your interests. I mentioned that your father was a professor at Carleton. I didn't mention that he was a professor of New Testament studies. Um, and sort of did they, I don't know anything about your mother, but how did they,
They were both
y-
educators. They
yeah,
met at Teachers College, actually in Montreal, out at MacDonald College in Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue. And
mhm,
after the war, my father was in the war. He was badly wounded in Normandy, and he was in a convalescent hospital next door to MacDonald College, and persuaded
mhm,
the director of the hospital to allow him to go next door and train as a teacher. And then under the provisions instituted by the Canadian government to allow veterans to go to university. He went to what was then Sir George Williams, now Concordia, did a BA in English, and then went on to McGill to do Bachelor of Divinity and a Master's, and then an Edinburgh PhD. So he became a United Church minister, but he mainly after a brief period as a minister in St. John, New Brunswick, after we came back from Scotland, in 1961 we moved to Toronto, and he taught at Emmanuel College, which is part of Victoria University in the University of Toronto. He was teaching trainees for the ministry mainly, but he was very interested in the ancient Mediterranean. He taught Greek, and so I was encouraged to study Greek and Latin, which I did at high school when you could still do that at high school in Ontario, and that provided, again, serendipitously, a wonderful background for what I went on to do later in life. So yeah, I think I was always encouraged. I was fortunate. I had parents who pushed education. I mean, they pushed me to excel, and I was able to go to a school that also pushed us very hard, and it was a wonderful background.
what
Uh,
school was it?
this was a school run by the University of Toronto
Oh,
Schools,
oh, UTS. Okay.
UPS,
Yeah.
and the education there was fantastic.
Mhm.
Although I have to say, I boast to my children I was a high school dropout because there was a grade 13 in Ontario in those days, and we moved to Ottawa at the end of grade 12, and I could have two options. I could go into a new school, high school for grade 13, or Carleton University allowed people in from grade 12. We did an extra, what they call a qualifying year, but it was university level courses. I opted for that. So I did a 5-year honors BA instead of a four. And, but I was a high school dropout technically.
Yeah. And that's interesting because I've known numerous academics over the years who were a product of UTS. I'd mentioned to you before Danny Vickers, who was a professor of history at UBC, um, who died more than 5 years ago now, but he was a great friend to me, a very important mentor. His father was the head of the art history department at the University of Toronto. And yes, he went on to Princeton to do his PhD and all sorts of other things. So it's clearly an important school for Canadian academia. Um, Now we're still on the subject of education. Did you? I mean, you clearly were excelling, but you might not have known where you wanted to end up. So did you have, while you were doing your undergraduate, for instance, multiple careers in mind, or did you always have it set in your mind that you wanted to be the person to write Rome in the 8th century, Rome in the 9th century?
No, it was a very circuitous path. I
Mm.
went to university thinking that what I really wanted was a career in the diplomatic service. So in high school, I was very involved in all the UN clubs and
Mhm.
that kind of thing. And uh, I actually, at the end of my fourth year, when I graduated with my BA, I wrote the exam for the civil service and passed it, and had an interview. And I didn't get through the interview. I was only 21. I was very young, and but that was my initial plan. And then plan B was that I received funding from the Ontario government to do a master's, and I went to do it in medieval studies at the University of Toronto Centre for Medieval Studies. I did medieval studies, not art history, because I didn't really think of myself as an art historian. I thought of myself as an historian. And the summer between them, I got a wonderful job working with uh, National Historic Parks and Sites in Ottawa. And I actually held that job for 3 summers, May to August, for 3 years, doing research in the National Library and Archives to write position papers on various individuals. So people would write in and say, you should put up a historical plaque to Richard Pollard. And that was
Mhm.
a committee that would make, a decision on this, but they needed a briefing paper. So my job and that of another colleague, another student who became a lifelong friend, our job was to write these position papers. That sort of what's the case for putting up a plaque, and that taught me a lot of very practical skills about doing archival research. And so it was always I was always straddling the line between history and art history, because I didn't really think of myself as an art historian. I wasn't interested in connoisseurship. Was this a Picasso or a Rembrandt, or
Mhm.
it didn't really interest me. What I was interested in buildings and objects as historical documents. It was the history aspect of it that fascinated me. So I went to Toronto to do medieval studies, and I went to work with an archaeologist who was excavating at late antique sites in Turkey, Michael Goff, who had written a wonderful book on early Christian art and archaeology. And sadly, he had a heart attack and died in that year. So and he wasn't going to be replaced. So clearly, I had to leave. And after the Masters was a wonderful year. I learned, it honed my medieval Latin skills, it honed my Greek paleographical skills, and I did take some history of art courses with Elizabeth L. Foldy, who was a wonderful scholar and teacher, um, and the partner of Andreas L. Foldy, famous historian. And but I took a year off after the Masters, and I got married and traveled extensively in Europe on an extended honeymoon, 6-month honeymoon. And during that time, I applied to 3 programs, all very different. I applied to the Master of Museology program at Toronto because I thought, museum work was certainly something I could be interested in, working with objects. I applied to the MPhil program at the Warburg Institute in London, which was I called it combined historical studies, but basically it was about reception of the antique and so on in the Renaissance. And I applied to the doctoral program at the Courtauld, and I'm pleased to say I was accepted at all 3, but funding was an issue. I was pretty much penniless, and had a partner, and we needed funding. And again, the Canadian government came through with a doctoral fellowship, but it could only be used for a PhD, and the other 2 were not doctoral programs. So I ended up going to the Courtauld. it was great because I had two co-supervised by two wonderful people who had much the same attitude towards objects as I did. The connoisseurship and so on was very secondary, and it was just at a time when British teaching of art history was being invaded by something called the new art history that looked more at social issues and historical issues and not so much at traditional connoisseurship. And so it was a good time to be there. And one of my supervisors, Julian Gardner, said we came up eventually with a topic for my thesis, which is the Church of San Clemente in Rome and the early medieval paintings in the excavated lower church. It was an archaeological excavation. It was perfect. And it had been excavated 100 years earlier. They'd kept no notes, so it was a bit of a challenge. But Julian said to me, he said, if you're going to spend some time in Rome, you should stay at the British School, where he had been a Rome scholar about a decade earlier. And I did. And the director of the school at the time, David Whitehouse, was an early medieval archaeologist. And boy, did we ever hit it off. And the school had a skeleton staff in those days, but David tried to, he was a pottery specialist, but his archaeology was aimed at, okay, not let's see what we can find at this site. It was, here's an historical issue that I need to solve or explore. What site will help me to do that? And so he chose his sites carefully. And he'd excavated primarily in Iran and Afghanistan, but he also had done a lot of work on Italian pottery and was engaged in work in Italy. And because he didn't have much of a staff, he was very full-time engaged in administration. So he would get up early, get up at 5 in the morning and work 5 to 8 in the morning on his own material. So when he came to British School breakfasts, he had just spent a couple of hours thinking about his own stuff, and he wanted to talk about it. So I always made sure I was there at 8 o'clock and sat beside him. And he taught me about medieval archaeology, and then actually invited me to work on some of the British School excavations. So I had 1 foot in history of art at that point and 1 foot in archaeology, and that really suited me very well.
So did you actually go and get your hands dirty at a dig site?
I had already in high school. The
Okay.
Toronto Board of Education ran Saturday programs for total nerds like myself, who just Monday to Friday wasn't enough. And one of them was archaeology, and we actually excavated an indigenous site just north of Toronto. And there's something very exciting when you're digging and you find objects, and you're the first person in 600 or 700 years to see them. In Italy, no, I did not actually wield a trowel, but I worked as a finds specialist.
Mm-hmm.
David was working with Charles McClendon, who later taught many years at Yale, at the site of the Abbey of Farfa, just northeast of Rome. And they were excavating that, and they started in 1979 spring, and I was pressed into service because there were wall paintings and things that they were finding, and trying to deal with and trying to work out a history of the early medieval church. And so yes, but I did wield a trowel as a high school student.
You have the full gambit of the archaeological experience.
Yes,
That's wonderful.
I've worked as a sort of finds specialist, both for the Roman superintendents in the Roman Forum at the site of Santa Maria Antiqua, and also for the superintendents of Ostia, Lydia Paroli, who invited me to work on some finds from the Pianabella Basilica in Ostia. And so my subsequent work has often been with excavations, but it's been not the actual digging.
I asked Stephen Bednarski at Waterloo whether he had done any actual digging, and he said, "No, I have other people to do the digging.
Yeah,
I do the
students for the digging. Yeah.
yeah." Um, that's wonderful. So now we have a good idea of John up to about 1979, 1980.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to ask you to jump forward and ponder how you feel that your area or your areas of interest have changed in the scholarship since you graduated from the Courtauld, since about 1980, say.
Yeah. I think history of art has changed. It's become closer to sociology, less interested in material culture in many ways, certainly in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know really why that is, but now if you study art history in Canada or the US, a lot of it is about critical theory and gender issues and post-colonialism, and less engaged with actual buildings and objects. But I'm pleased to say exactly the opposite is true in Italy and in France and in Britain, where archaeology and the study of objects, and particularly the study of the early Middle Ages, has been a huge growth industry. So when I started working on San Clemente, no Italians were interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
They were only really interested in about 1300 onwards. And wow, and so I had no competition, right? I went
Mm-hmm.
to look at things, people said, oh, great, we're glad someone's interested, because no
Mm-hmm.
one else is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are many graduate programs. There are numerous graduate students. I've been external examiner on a number of Italian doctorates, and it's huge. There are journals. There's a journal devoted simply to medieval Rome, of all things.
Mm-hmm.
Mirabilia Romae, published out of the Center for Early Medieval Studies in Spoleto, edited by Claudia Bolgia. And so I'm very encouraged by what's happening in Europe, and a little less encouraged by what's happened over the last 40 years or so in North America. But there we are. We don't have the collections, they do. We don't have the monuments, they do. It makes sense for them, less sense for us to do that. And I think, as Canada has changed, certainly, and become multicultural. I mean, I live in Toronto, probably the most multicultural city in the world, and I think that's a really good thing. But it has meant that the European heritage interest in it has declined to some extent, and that's probably right. And we see that in the teaching of not only medieval art history, but medieval history and medieval studies, I think, across the country. So in 1979, when I got my first job at the University of Victoria, and I should jump in to say here, I was hired to teach all of Western art history, from the Middle Ages, late antiquity to the modern period, and had to do that initially, and then gradually, as the department grew, that shrunk to just the Middle Ages, which was great. And but in 1979, there were probably a dozen universities that had a full-time position for a medieval art historian. And now I think there are maybe 4, if that. It really has happened. What's happened is that as people have retired or left, they haven't been replaced in that field. They've been, the position has been shifted to something else. And I have to say, I'm guilty of that myself. When I was dean at Carleton, I was able to claw together the funding for a position in medieval art history, and Carleton used to have one. and it had fallen into abeyance, and I got funding to bring it back. And then we got a wonderful gift of huge collection of 18th century French prints and drawings, but had no one to look after it or deal with it or train students to use it. And I was persuaded that that made more sense than a medievalist. So, you know, so the position was shifted. But I rejoice that we still have a huge Center for Medieval Studies in Toronto and the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies, where I'm now an associate fellow. And these are attracting all kinds of students from across North America. A lot of Americans come. The postdocs that we have at the Pontifical Institute are largely European or coming here to work. Fantastic library resources. And so I think there is still a vibrant medieval studies community in Canada, but it's much more focused on Toronto and Montreal than it was when I came back to Canada in 1979.
I think you're right. I think from my own perspective as a medievalist, and this is just empirical, it's not judgmental. The Where before we had to justify our existence because the Middle Ages was backwards and horrible, now we have to justify our existence because studying the European Middle Ages is Eurocentric. So there's we've gone from out of the frying pan into the fire in a certain sense.
You know, as an historian, and I consider myself an historian,
Yeah.
The one thing I know for certain is that there will always be change. Nothing
Yes.
ever stays the same. Heraclitus was absolutely right. And change is not good or bad. It's change, as you say. It's empirical, and so you know I don't cast any value judgment on the loss of the teaching of medieval art history. It just happens, and maybe the pendulum will shift, or maybe it won't. But I am very encouraged by developments in Europe and particularly in Italy, where the early Middle Ages has, in recent decades, has become a subject of huge interest. You know, and the number of journals. I mean, when you look at journals like Medieval Archaeology and Medievale, which started in the 80s, so many journals now that are of recent conception, and huge number of faculty members and students working on the early Middle Ages. It's impossible to keep up with the bibliography. When I started teaching in 1979, I felt I could keep up with the bibliography on the entirety of the Middle Ages, from late antiquity through to 1500, all of Europe and Byzantium, and a little bit the Islamic world. And that has slowly shrunk simply because the bibliography is enormous. And I was trying to keep up interdisciplinary bibliography. Now I'm lucky if I can keep up with medieval Rome. There's so much being written.
Well, I sympathize. Now, I had another question that probably feeds from some of your answers in the last one. You started out at Victoria as just, this ordinary professor who was teaching all of art history. But I think you left Victoria as head of department. Is that correct? You were head of the...
No, I had been head of
Yeah,
department.
you had been.
But when I left, I wasn't. I'd done, I think, 6 or 7 years in a couple of stints. And I'd also been director. I was a co-founder of an interdisciplinary medieval studies program at Victoria that still runs, and I had been director of that for 3 years as well.
So you've done quite a lot of administration already at Victoria, and then you moved to Queen's where you were head of department, and then dean at Carleton. And I was wondering whether you could reflect on how my father was an academic, but he ended up with a chair. but he have always avoided administration. He never wanted to be head of department. He never wanted any of that.
Yep, my father
Um,
was the same. Yep, he never wanted to
and
be chair, department chair.
so I was wondering whether you could reflect
Yeah,
on
no, I
how,
got into it fairly early. I'd
yeah,
been at Victoria 4 years, and I was asked to be acting chair for a year while the chair was on sabbatical. And I found I liked it because you could get things done. So at Victoria, I was able to bring in a PhD program. I was able to develop an undergraduate program in medieval studies. I was able to do all kinds of really interesting things. And I didn't seek the job either at Queen's or at Carleton. They sought me, and I wasn't sure that that's what I wanted to do. But when I went to Queen's, the department had three, it was like an umbrella for three separate programs: art history, fine arts, and art conservation. And I suddenly had to learn. I didn't know anything about art conservation. I knew very little about contemporary fine arts. So I had to learn these things in order to be an advocate for those programs. And then it really blossomed when I went to Carleton, where I had 18 academic units for which I was responsible. And the biggest one by far was psychology. And I just had to learn. It meant going to lectures in other programs, other in departments almost every night. And fortunately, or unfortunately, but when I agreed to move, I wanted to postpone the actual physical move for 2 years. So for 2 years, I wanted my children to finish high school at KCVI. It doesn't exist anymore. I think you know it. And
yeah,
I wanted, because they had the move from Victoria to Kingston had been quite disruptive for them. We didn't want to put them through that again. So we wanted to get them all through high school. So what I did is I went up Sunday night to Ottawa, and I had an apartment, and I came back Friday night. Not every weekend, but usually 3 out of 4. And so I was available. I didn't have family obligations in evenings, Monday through Thursday, and I could go to lectures and events in my faculty and get to know the faculty. And I did. I had 320 full-time faculty members, and I knew them all by first name and what they did. And it was great. And it really was a wonderful time in terms of broadening my intellectual perspectives. And I would like to think that the 10 years I served as dean was the highlight of my career in many ways, certainly from an admin point of view. I really loved that job.
hmm, it's interesting. Um, and do you feel that it enriched your own research in having all these different influences, different contacts?
I'm not sure that it did. In fact, for 10 years, my research was pretty much on hold. So if you look at my publications list, it's pretty thin from 2005 through to the end of my time as dean. And I just didn't have time. I was working 80 hours a week at my
Hmm.
at my day job, and which was also a many weekend job. And but it helped. I think it what it did do was give me a wonderful perspective on the world. I mean, I got to travel, places like China I never would have gone to, and I met so many fascinating people. It was really extraordinary. Because a lot of people came to Ottawa, and we were there, and I made a wonderful partnership with the Italian ambassador and many other people, and some of our governors general. And I look on that as simply as part of a very rich and rewarding life. But the research went by, was on the back burner until I finished as dean, and I had a 2-year admin leave, and I started to get back into it. And then um, after some after personal tragedy. I lost my wife to brain cancer, and then I thought, okay, life is short. I need to focus really hard on getting all these projects that I've been thinking about. I need to get them all done. And
Hmm.
so since 2017, that's been my focus the last 8 years. And I think I've been reasonably productive.
Reasonably. Um, now, I had some questions to follow on from that about Canada and medieval studies. And I wanted to ask, well, one of the things that's been very important in your life has been the British School of Rome.
Yeah,
And I think you mentioned to me previously that you try to visit every year,
yeah,
um, and
every
you've had various roles or fellowships or other things, very strong connection. I think you're probably the most important Canadian insofar as the British School at Rome is concerned. What would you say to other Canadian scholars in your field or in adjacent fields about the British school, in terms of its importance, whether they should think about, studying there or staying there, that sort of thing?
I would say it's a wonderful opportunity. It's my intellectual home in the world. It's the place I feel most at home. Um, I mean, the downside of doing field research is that you're on your own a lot, and the upside of being in Rome, if you're Canadian, British, or any member of the Commonwealth, is that you're able to stay at the British School, which provides you with a community. It provides you with a dinner in the evening with other scholars and people to talk to and share ideas with. And one of the great things about British School is there's a sort of habit of people get uh, permission to visit sites that are not normally open. They usually say, "Can we bring a few people from the British School?" And the answer is usually yes. And so a notice will go up on the board and saying, we're visiting I don't know, the catacomb of San Valentino, which is a visit I organized on St. Valentine's Day in 1979. Seemed appropriate. Would you like to come? And so I got a chance to see a huge number of things for which I would not have used any political social capital to get a permission myself because I didn't need to see it for my research. But it was interesting. I'm interested in Rome and not just in the Middle Ages, but in other periods. And I feel I've seen just about everything in Rome at some point.
Mhm.
I've been on the roof of a Pantheon. How many people can say that? And that came through a British School connection. Um, I've been at many classical sites. I've had Caravaggio tours, and I've done all kinds of amazing things, and it's all because of the British School, and also the connections I made there led to many projects, including cataloging a whole series of catalog raisonné of a series of 17th century drawings in the Royal Library at Windsor, drawings that recorded medieval antiquities. That came through my personal connection to Amanda Claridge, who was the assistant director for many years. Tim Potter at the British Museum at breakfast one day he said, "I have this early medieval sculpture from the site I'm excavating at Montegelato. Would you catalog it for me?" Yeah, okay. So um, I can't begin to list all the projects I've worked on that were facilitated by the British School connection. And my fear is that at some point the British Academy is going to say, we we're not here for Canadians and Australians. We're here for Brits. And I hope that day will never come. I think the charter of the British School, as it was set up, specifies Britain and Empire, now thought of as Britain and Commonwealth. So I hope we maintain that connection. But it's just a wonderful, wonderful place, and it has a superb library. And if any Canadian is going to work in Rome, and I know many have been there and do, that is a wonderful place to be. I have colleagues at Carleton, colleagues here in Toronto, who stay in British School. They use their Canadian connection. So, and I've had students go there as well.
I was there, and that's in fact where we met. So I can attest to everything that you just said. Now, coming back from the BSR as a Canadian, I was wondering whether you could talk about how working in Canada has shaped what you've done or what you've thought about or the way that you've worked. And you have had the privilege of working in sort of central Canada, the national capital in Kingston, which and I also worked in British Columbia as well, and I remember it being rather different, being on the West Coast. So whether that also plays into whether there's a different way of working within very disparate parts of Canada in your field, or whether that changed your perspective.
Well, there's certainly different challenges. I mean, when I worked in Victoria, I would, fly back from Rome to Victoria on a Sunday night often, and it was a 10-hour flight, Rome, Toronto, and then you got through customs, and you got another 5-hour flight to Vancouver, and then you had to wait a couple hours for the little hop to Victoria. Now there are direct Toronto Victoria flights that made things a lot easier, but it's a long trip, and medieval Rome is not hugely in the consciousness of people in Victoria. Not that it is in Eastern Canada either, but it certainly makes it easier to get there. I think I mentioned I now live in Toronto, and I can get on a plane in Toronto and get off in Rome. It's the first time in my life that's been possible, because in Kingston or Ottawa, it wasn't. So it's really amazing. It means you can go more often, perhaps. It's not so wearing on the body, and but yes, there are challenges, and I think I've alluded to one of them is simply the lack of monuments and collections that we have here. Although Toronto has some collections, and Montreal does too. But there's no medieval collection in Victoria. Amazingly, they have a few medieval objects that were brought by people who immigrated from Britain, but they tend to be medieval British objects. But there's a wonderful alabaster, for example, that the University of Victoria has. Anyway, so yes, I think there are challenges, but I remember saying to myself, about 1980, after I was settling into Victoria, and I loved living there. It's a wonderful place to live and to raise children, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought, well, I'll probably be here forever, so I can do two things. I can sort of give up scholarship, or I can try to turn Victoria into a hub, and I did the latter. So I recruited doctoral students, and we had a couple of people, amazing medieval scholars like Erica Dodd, who retired to Victoria, and I made sure that they were involved and they would teach graduate seminars and continue to publish. And we had an informal, quite apart from any formal academic seminar, we had something called the Medieval Art Research Group that I founded that met couple of times each term, and where we all presented what we were working on. and gave each other feedback. And it was a wonderful community there. But it takes, it takes someone to say, okay, this is going to happen, and let's make it happen. What do we need to do?
There's a it speaks a bit to your maybe your optimism about what is possible, I guess, that you had this idea and then you're like, well, the only thing that is between this idea and the reality is somebody championing it and
Well,
putting in the work to do it.
I've always been the ultimate pragmatist, and I think that's what
Mhm.
enabled me to. I'd like to think I was a good dean and department chair and so on, because I would say, okay, here's the problem. What's the solution?
Mhm.
How do we get to a solution? Let's find a way.
Okay.
And if that means raising money, when I was told art conservation was too expensive and I had to close it down, I said, no, I'll find the money. And Getty came through with $300,000, and I talked to the Mellon and all kinds of other people, and we saved it. And so, but it takes work, and it takes energy. I hope I have the energy. Maybe not so much now, but I'm retired now. But that's, I don't need it. But yeah, and I think there's been a number of others that I've had the privilege to know who have had a similar idea. So my very good friend Malcolm Thirlby, who started teaching, well, when he in 1979, I guess he was already in Canada by then. He was teaching full-time, part-time. He's certainly teaching at Concordia in Montreal, and he had the idea of bringing together all the medieval art historians in the Montreal area, because I guess there were 4 universities that had them,
Mhm.
for a one day just to talk about it. Let's talk about what we're doing, talk in English or French. And that first meeting was in 1980. We will have the 43rd meeting of that group next March here in Toronto. And I've hosted it many a time. I was not at the first meeting. At the second meeting, because the first was so successful, he extended it to every university in Canada.
Mhm.
And I saw the notice, and I went. I think the second one was I think it was in Toronto, and then the third one was in Western in London, Ontario.
Mhm.
And then I think the next one was in Victoria. I offered to host, and it's just always been a small, informal group. We don't have a president or even a secretary. It's whoever agrees to host the meeting in a given year does the work to set it up. And it's now, numbers have dwindled in terms of medieval art historians, so it's every second year now. But it will be next year, 2026, here in Toronto. It was at McGill in 2024. And it will be the 43rd. And it's been a wonderful venue for, it's always tried to encourage graduate students. And we've had many graduate students who got their feet wet there, who have gone on to careers. There are many Canadians teaching the history of art in Britain, in Australia, in many in the US. Simply because there have been jobs there and nothing at home. But it's helped them get a job that they have had conference experience, and they've been able to hone their skills in terms of public presentations by speaking at this annual meeting. And it's been great for me, because one of my most recent article in the journal Gesta, International Center for Medieval Art, just out this spring issue of Gesta, on a wonderful 6th century censer in a Turkish museum collection. I presented that at a meeting in Toronto, and I've forgotten the year now. It was 2022, I think, and at a meeting of this group. And I posed a question to which I didn't have an answer. And my wonderful friend of many years, but now my colleague at Pontifical Institute, Linda Safran, put up her hand afterwards. I think I have the answer to your question. And that led to this joint article
Okay.
now in Gesta. So that has really helped. And it certainly helped to bring that group to Victoria and also to bring students from Victoria to participate in it. And that meant getting them funding. In the early days, we would get funding from SWRC for that meeting, and then that dried up. But I was very lucky. I was able to develop some skills in writing grant applications, and I was able to get SWRC money to support my graduate students and bring them with me to conferences and bring them to Italy and so on. So.
Well, that's wonderful. Great. But I think we've dealt with the next question already. So I'm just going to move on to a section I call Glimpsing the Future.
Okay.
And I was wondering whether you could tell me if, you were granted an extra 45 or 50 years, because that's how long you've been studying Rome, medieval Rome and other things, but particularly medieval Rome, because that's it's been sort of the thread that's run through your whole life, I think. What would you choose to do?
My answer will surprise you, I think.
Yeah.
So I would probably abandon Rome. So I think I mentioned that, when I started working on Rome, no one else was doing it. In 2023, there was a conference, Roma Decimo Secolo, in Rome. And I have to say the 10th century is the least known period of medieval Rome, because we have the fewest texts and we have the fewest monuments, the fewest objects, the fewest documents, the least information.
Was it
There were
Gregorius said that it was the Dunkel Jahrhundert or something like that?
Yeah, going back to Baronio in the 16th century.
Yeah.
Been called the dark century.
Yes.
We had 58 speakers. 58 speakers at a conference on 10th century Rome. And that is the best indication I can give you of how early medieval Rome is now. It's been a growth industry. And there are wonderful people. They're there. They're mainly based in Rome. They're on the spot. They're making new discoveries. There's a lot of new archaeology in Rome since the 1980s, a lot of it related to the expansion of the Metropolitana subway. And I'm very happy to see them do it. I would go back, if I had another 50 years, I would go back to my first love, which was Venice. And when I started out, I tried to balance Rome and Venice. So a number of my publications deal with Venetian topics. I had to give that up when I became the dean of Carbline. I just couldn't keep up with both Rome and Venice. But I would go back to Venice, which is Rome. I always say Rome has my head, but Venice has my heart. And I love the place. It's where I first got involved in studying material culture. It was the first European city, apart from Britain, outside of Britain, that I spent time in. And if I go back now, I don't know if I'll have another European trip in my future, but if I do it, I think it would be to Venice.
Okay.
And, I love that place. So, and there's a lot to be done there. Similarly, there's been a lot of archaeology, early medieval archaeology in Venice in my lifetime. Things are changing. A lot of people are interested in the early medieval history of Venice. Fewer in the material culture, but some. And there's a lot, I think, still to be done there. But Rome, I'll leave to my Italian colleagues, who are all many dear friends.
And is there a particular place in Venice that you would say is your favorite?
Yes, Torcello, the island of Torcello.
Okay.
Which has two early medieval churches.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went there in 1970, you could go out there. You'd be the only person in them for an entire afternoon. And now tourism has discovered them. But there's still wonderful places to be, and still compared to San Marco, for example, they're still unspoiled. San Marco, you could just wander in and out. There was no queue, there was no barriers, there was no lineup. The entire thing was open. Now there's a one-way system, and you have to queue up. I mean, it's crazy. And I
like
have a
the
lot of
Vatican
sympathy.
museums.
I have a lot of sympathy for the Venetians to say we can't handle the tourists.
Yes. Is there a place in Italy that you feel is undervisited?
Oh, there are many. There are many,
If
many. Um,
you have to choose one.
oh gosh. Well, my two favorite places. Well, three.
Yeah.
Well, Ravenna is undervisited, but even Ravenna now is becoming quite popular as a tourist destination. But the two places I go to when I want just to have a few days of tranquility, but things to do and look at are Lucca in Tuscany and Trento on the way up to Austria, north of Verona. Trento in particular, it's a wonderful town, rarely gets many tourists. It's a university town, so there's a cafe life that's vibrant, prices aren't high, interesting things to see, and Lucca very much the same. So those are the places I like to spend time.
I think one of my favorite memories is finding the maze outside of one of the churches in Lucca.
Yes, yes, outside the
That's
cathedral.
I found that, and I was, uh, it won my heart and we
Yeah,
were only
and
in Lucca for a
that's
day.
another project. If I had another 50 years, I might look into that. The reason there's a maze there is because obviously it's seen as a journey, a metaphor for the journey through life, but it's also seen as a metaphor for pilgrimage. And Luke was on the pilgrimage route. It was on the road to Rome. It passed through Lucca and then down through Siena, the Via Francigena, and that explains the wonderful maze on the outside the cathedral in Lucca. Yeah.
Um, Now, not speaking of yourself, but maybe going back to something that we mentioned before, where do you see your field going in the next decade or so? We've already talked about how it's different between North America and Europe, and you've mentioned the great interest, great and growing interest in medieval Rome, even in the 10th century. But are there any trends that you see sort of in
Absolutely.
embryo now?
Yeah. There's a wonderful trend towards interdisciplinarity. So those who work on the ancient world have for a long time just taken for granted that archaeologists will work with historians, who will work with specialists in textual studies and so on, and that's all really one discipline. Medievalists have not had that approach until now, and that was the great thing about the Rome in the 10th century conference. It brought together historians, art historians, archaeologists, textual specialists, and I think that is the way of the future. And that's why I'm very encouraged by things like the Center and the Pontifical Institute here in Toronto that focus on medieval studies, not necessarily medieval history or medieval art history or whatever. That we still have many disciplines that are lacking. There's not a lot of medieval archaeology in Toronto at the moment, but most of the others are well represented. Excuse me.
That's an interesting point.
But I think that is the way of the future, and certainly the Europeans are discovering this, and more are working in interdisciplinary teams. Medieval historians, if I may say so, long thought it was wonderful to put images on the covers of their books, but they weren't present in the contents of the book, and that's changing. And I'm going to single out a wonderful medieval historian in Rome, Paolo de Logu, who has really been a pioneer of trying to bring material culture into his historical studies. And now everyone's doing it.
I
So
think
that's the way of the future.
in fairness, I think the cover image is imposed a lot of the time by the publisher.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I remember Rosamond having great struggles with the cover for her Charlemagne book in 2008 because they refused to put any kind of textual thing. They wanted an image of Charlemagne, but the only image of Charlemagne that they had besides the coin was things from much later, and they wanted it to be colorful, and so it
yeah.
was
Or
it
cover sell books,
yes, exactly. People judge them by their cover. Um, Now the last question I had planned for, and we've made good time here, is what recommendation, what advice would you give to a student finishing her or finishing his PhD in any part of medieval studies today? And I'm going to preface this, or yes, I'm going to add to this question by saying that, one of the reasons that I was so appreciative of knowing you was the advice that you gave me when I was at the BSR, when you talked to me about how you had found your job at Victoria by writing to all of these different institutions, asking whether there were any possibilities of jobs. It didn't pan out for me directly, but it did mean that I came to the notice of um, a fair number of people like Courtney Booker and Paul Dutton, who I later ended up working with. So, in fact, it was ultimately helpful to make contact with these people. But more generally, what would you say to somebody who was finishing or starting or being in the middle of their PhD in medieval studies now?
for someone starting, I would say choose the supervisor well. Choose a supervisor who is active as a scholar and has a network, and they will plug you into that network because, as you've just mentioned, having a network is a really useful thing. If people know who you are and what you do, that will give you, the proverbial leg up in terms of finding employment. And so that's important. And if you're already in a doctoral program or finishing one, go to conferences, give papers. A lot of institutions will still support graduate students going to conferences. Go to Leeds, go to Kalamazoo, and ask questions, make yourself known, talk to people at tea and coffee, and you have to be proactive, and that applies to not just to academics, but to every field of endeavor. Right? It's the people who are active and who are known and who are well networked who will get the jobs. And I can attest to that from many other areas. The other thing is you have to be open to teaching things that you've never thought about teaching. And the more interdisciplinary you can be, the more options you will have. So when I went to Victoria, I taught Western art history, including a survey course of 1750 to the present that had 150 fine art students. I had never studied modern art history. And that was a huge challenge. I had to teach, I taught it for 2 years. I recruited some of my best medieval graduate students from that class. But I had to stay just, a week ahead of the class in terms of reading and thinking. And it helped that I had seen a lot of the stuff in European museum collections, and that I had a broad background in European history. But it was a challenge, and a lot of people would say, "No, I can't teach that. I have no background." Well, you do what you have to do. And I think you have to have a willingness. And one of the big disagreements I have with one of my children who is from a different generation and says, oh, it's all about work-life balance. Um, you don't get to be the Wimbledon tennis champion by having a work-life balance. You get to be the Wimbledon tennis champion by playing tennis hours and hours and hours, 7 days a week. And you get to rise to the top of a crowded field of job applicants by being engaged. And if you're someone who says, well, I don't work after 4 o'clock, well, you're not going to be successful as an academic. That's just being an academic is a lifestyle. It's not a job. It's a lifestyle. You have to embrace it if you want to succeed in it. And I'm sorry if people don't like that, but that's the reality.
Was this a lesson that was imparted to you by your father, or was it something that you learned on your own?
I think I learned it on my own.
Okay.
My father he never wanted to do any administration. He loved his students, and he was always there for them. And he was the stereotypical absent-minded professor who was always lost in his thoughts and so on. But he found time for some other things. But yes, no, he devoted more than 40 hours a week to his job.
Yeah. And from what I understand, he came to stay with you when he was stricken with cancer. Is that correct?
Just before he retired at 65, when there was still mandatory retirement in 1985, and he moved to Victoria. He loved it out there, and he started coming to my classes, but it was during his first year there he was diagnosed with cancer and passed.
So he got to, it must have been very interesting for him to see you developed as a teacher, a professor, a researcher.
No, I was the only of his four children. I was really the only one that sort of went into anything remotely related to what he did. Obviously, I have a huge interest in religion, history of religion, which I shared with him, although our religious beliefs were very different. And I was initially considered myself a Byzantinist. When I was given a choice in my master's year between Greek paleography or Latin paleography, I chose Greek, and never regretted that, because I was able to work. I worked with Greek manuscripts and so on, and it's been a wonderful experience. And sort of lost the thread there, I think. But
no, that's all right. So, John, thank you so much for doing this interview. I'm sure that anybody who's watching or reading this will come away with a good sense of, what made you what you are, and what interests you, and what you think about being a medievalist, being an academic, all the things that are important to you in that regard. And I think we're really privileged to hear you talk about this. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Richard. I think all academics are privileged, and we should never take it for granted. And I can't imagine anyone will be much interested in this interview, but I'm grateful to you for it. It's been a pleasure, a true pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you.